Rugby World Cup warm-ups, folks. England against Ireland this weekend. A little bit of an extra spicy meatball with the Owen Farrell thing kind of dragging its way out. But we are going to go through the two squads which have been picked. It's rubbish day here in Auckland if you can hear the bins being collected outside. What else are we going over? Some stats, recent history predictions. And you guys can let us know your thoughts on how this one may be going to go. I've just sat and watched the kind of pre-match press conference from both Borthwick and Farrell, that's Andy, and they were both a bit testy regarding the old Owen Farrell clearing and then subsequent appeal, which is from Steve Borthwick's view very disruptive and going to kind of drag on for a lot more time. Otherwise, he would have been playing this weekend, but the whole thing has meant that he's had to pull out of the squad. And Andy Farrell, basically said before they asked him, look, I'm biased, so don't ask me about it. And then he proceeded to be like, this is all a circus. And all these kind of journos are getting their 15 minutes of fame kind of thing piling in. Also clearly not a very happy chappy about the way things have gone. But putting that to one side, the recent history between Ireland and England has kind of flipped on its head. The last five, three go to Ireland. And those are the most recent three matches in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And they've all kind of been beyond a score, 32-18, 32-15, 29-16. So all kind of relatively, similar scorelines. Whereas then you've got back in the Autumn Nations Cup with COVID and Andy Farrell took over. And I personally wasn't that convinced by him in that first year. 2020 they lost 18-7 in the previous one. In the Six Nations that year they lost 24-12. So yeah, there's definitely been a turning point, I guess, in both of these sides across this kind of last, 3 and a bit years. But it'll be an interesting one. Obviously Ireland number one side in the world, England with a new coach. They're both in very kind of different positions, and Ireland will go into this one as big time favourites with the game being played in Dublin. And they've pricked pretty much, not quite, but pretty much their full strength starting side. Andrew Porter comes back into the starting front row alongside Dan Sheehan and Tadhg Furlong. So Porter and Sheehan back into the 23. Furlong is up from the bench. That rubbish truck's really loud. Tadhg, Byrne and James Ryan, that's your starting second row as well. James Ryan is captain for this one, obviously, with Sexton still serving out his ban. And, that's a pretty tidy looking second row. Tadhg, Byrne, his ability to break down, and then James Ryan, the big physical beast and work rate the machine that he is. They complement each other pretty well. Peter O'Mahony, Josh van der Flier and Cian Prendergast are the back row, which means Caelan Doris, who started at 7 last week, drops to the bench for last week, a fortnight ago. And van der Flier returns alongside kind of O'Mahony. And Prendergast is maybe the kind of odd man out in terms of not being the regular starter. Usually that's kind of Doris. That's usually his jersey, or potentially Conan. But I think you'd be pretty happy with that as well. I know Peter O'Mahony cops a fair bit of stick, but with his ability in the air, genuinely brings something a bit different, plus a bag of experience as well. Gibson-Park and Ross Byrne, that's your all lengths, the 9-10 combo. Ross Byrne maybe has a little bit of extra pressure on him. They brought that up in the press conference as well. And Andy Farrell basically said if your 10 is not looking that great, it's often because the pack in front of him is not doing that good. So I don't want to say it's a kind of pre-excuse, but I do want to say Ross Byrne could do with a good game. Behind this number one in the world side pack. I have been a kind of big supporter of Ross Byrne over the years, and sometimes he leaves me with egg on my face, but I do think he's a good player. He's not like a great running 10, but he's a good distributor and kind of keeps the ball moving, which is what you want from him. Get the ball to the people who are the game breakers. Bundee and Garry Ringrose, that is your midfield. So both those guys back into the 23. James Lowe and Mack Hansen, the kind of two preferred wing options, are back in business as well. Expect to see a fair bit of that big old boot from James Lowe. And then Hugo Keenan is there at fullback. Ever reliable as he is. And in Auckland style, it has just started raining to go with the rubbish truck in the background. Rob Herring, Jerry Loughman, and Finlay Bealham. Those are your front row replacements. So Loughman and Bealham into the side. Good to get a bit more game time into those fellas. McCarthy and Doris dropped to the bench after starting the last game. Conor Murray's back into the side. Jack Crowley and Keith Earls are also dropping to the bench. And I think they said this is going to be Keith Earls' 100th game. So what a way to do it right before a World Cup at home. probably his last game in Ireland, so what a fantastic way to bring up that milestone for him. Big congratulations to him and his family. He has been a mainstay of that Irish side for quite some time. For England, like I mentioned, no Owen Farrell means that you've got Ford starting at 10. But before we get to him, we'll start with the Ford pack, which is Genge, George and Stewart. So Genge is the only change there. He comes up from the bench, which is a change from last week. Jamie George needs to give a few minutes to Theo Dan. Like, Borthwick doesn't like giving anybody else any game time apart from Jamie George at hooker. Like, if you've seen the England depth chart video, I'll put it up there. It's horrendous how few minutes have been given to anybody else. I mean, Caelan Dickie's the other guy, but he's not at the World Cup because he's injured. So, Theo Dan, please bring him on. It doesn't matter. Like, this game, I know it matters, but it doesn't matter, if you know what I mean. Give the guy a game. You don't want this guy, Theo Dan, in his third appearance on the bench to potentially have to go into a World Cup game if George got injured, having 10 minutes under his belt at test level. Anyway, that's your front row. Tadhg and Ribbons is the second row, so Tadhg continues on. Ribbons comes into the 23. He replaces George Martin. Courtney Lawes, Ben Earl, and Billy Vildipola. That is the same kind of back row as last weekend. Courtney Lawes will captain the side from the back row in the absence of Owen Farrell. Ben Earl was one of the guys who actually looked pretty decent, man, in that not the best game against Wales last week, but Ben Earl was a bit of a standout, showing his work rate as well. So his battle up against Van der Fleer will be interesting. Ben Youngs and George Ford, actually 19 combos, so that's a lot of experience. Expect them to kick, I would say, a fair amount. They will have to be careful, like I mentioned, because James Lowe is like to return it to you with interest if you kick poorly, but George Ford is a pretty adept booter of the ball, so I expect to see that aspect of his game on display. Manu Tuilagi and Joe Marchant, that's your midfield. So Tuilagi comes into the 23. Apparently he's had a bit of a niggle in the build-up, so he's a little bit behind schedule in terms of the prep, but good to see him in the side. He'll be running some big lines. Daly and Watson are your wings, so Daly continues on. Watson comes in on the right wing, and then Freddie Steward there at fullback. His battle against Hugo Keenan is always just a fascinating one because they're both so good under the high ball. Replacements, Theo Dan, like I mentioned. Joe Marler drops to the bench. Kyle Sinclair is back. Chesham is also back. Jack Willis is there. Danny Kerr comes in. Obviously, Van Poortvliet's out for the World Cup injured, so it is the experience of Ben Youngs and Danny Kerr. That's probably the most experienced halfback duo in World Rugby going to the World Cup at this point. Marcus Smith comes in. Ollie Lawrence drops to the bench. Stats-wise, it is going to be an interesting one because Ireland, man, there's so many aspects of their game. When you look at all the stats across all the teams, that Ireland is just the number one team. I don't think any game this year they have had less possession or territory than their opposition. I think there might have been one or two games where it was 50-50. But I don't think there's any game where they've had less possession and territory. I don't think there's any game where the other teams had more run meters than them. I don't think there's any game where they've had more clean breaks than the other team. I don't think they've been out try-scored. And I don't think they've had any yellows or reds this year. So there's a bunch of remarkable facts about this Irish team which puts them in a fantastic position on the verge of this World Cup. They outpass everybody. Their rate of recycled ball is just incredible. And they can kick pretty well from the base of the ruck from Gibson-Park or like I mentioned, Lowe's big cannon of a boot as well. England, on the other hand, multiple cards last week, was a little bit uncharacteristic because I think mostly this season their record's been pretty decent. I think they have a couple of cards against Ireland in the Six Nations, but for the most part, they haven't been too bad with getting cards. Last week, as I said, being a bit of an exception. But, man, they're conceding some tries. I think across their last 4 games, they've conceded 15 tries, and they just can't score. I think they scored 3. So they're going to need to get that right very soon, because that's a horrendous number. I know they can kick penalties for days, but goodness me, you can't be going with a record like that and then going to Dublin and trying to outscore the Irish with tries. Seems like a bit of a tough ask. But anyway, they have been getting a few more tries. They got one last week, which is an area of strength for them. And I feel like they got one against Ireland in the last game in the Six Nations. And they have been kicking a lot. England kick under Borthwick more than anybody else. More than 30 kicks a game. So they are going to need to kick really well against Ireland to get the most out of the side that they've picked. But like I said, it's that kind of X-factor finishing touch. If you can get yourself in the right field position, you still need to be able to finish off those chances, which is where they are a little bit lacking right now. Across these last 5 games, it is pretty close. The average score is 22-18 to Ireland. But like I mentioned, the last 3 games are all kind of 7+ point results for Ireland, almost like 2 tries. For the most part. So they do have the wood over the English in recent times. And that's where the bookies are going with their prediction. They're saying Ireland by 15 points. The Rugby Forecast algorithm is going 16 points. So either way, Ireland is supposed to get this one done in a bit of a canter. Although it will be interesting to see just kind of what reaction the England squad has to this Owen Farrell thing. Whether it kind of galvanises them and, you know, like we saw last week when they had 12 men, that seemed to kind of lift them in a way. So if that kind of reaction comes, they might be able to push the Irish a bit closer than that, or potentially even get a wee win. It is on from the Aviva at Dublin. It is a, I think, 5:30 local kickoff, which is, I think, 4:30 in the morning for those of us in New Zealand, which is kind of horrendous. And there is a New Zealand connection with Paul Williams as the ref. If you want to get yourself some England rugby gear in support of Owen Farrell, or just because you're an England fan and want to buy a new jersey for this season, check out England Rugby Store. I'll put a link down in the description. They have lots of England rugby gear, funnily enough, and their store has heaps of stuff. It's not just jerseys. They've got all kinds of other rugby paraphernalia. But yes, you guys let us know your thoughts on this one. How do you reckon this is going to go? We are nearing the end of the Rugby World Cup prep cycle, and you can see from the lineups for this one, 2 really strong teams, more or less. There's a few guys missing, but more or less the kind of strongest sides on offer. But yeah, you guys let us know your thoughts. We hope for no injuries or red cards for this one. But yeah, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.